So what this is more of kind of like a taster menu to give you, I think, hopefully, a little bit more of a feel for the kind of things you're likely to uncover if you go and stick a net into your garden pond and have a look at it, what comes out, either in a white tray or under a hand lens or even under a microscope if you've got one. And I would say if you've got a garden pond and you can get hold of a microscope of any kind, I would strongly encourage you to do so, because it's a whole new world and it's a wonderful thing to see. So what I'm going to talk about here today, I'm going to focus on these main areas. We'll start off talking a little bit about what is a pond, which is a surprisingly contentious subject. And then I'll talk a little bit more about pond biodiversity, about the main groups of things that you're likely to come across. And then I'm going to talk about pond ecology, how ponds works, the mechanics of it, and things that tend to happen in a pond. And then following on from that, a little bit about pond construction, how to design a garden pond. It may be that you're under lockdown, that you're thinking of building a garden pond, or you've been looking at your garden pond and thinking it's a bit tired and maybe you want to do a little bit of management or change how it is. If so, I hope that I can give you some pointers. I'm going to talk a little bit about invasive non-native species, which is a serious problem in freshwaters, and then a little bit about pond management as well. I should say I was hoping to do something a little bit more interactive. The interest in this course has been so high that I felt it would be very difficult with 82 people signed up. I know that we've only got 55 or so, but even so, it's quite a lot. So I haven't really planned for any interactive stuff, but I'd like to do a little bit of question and answer all the way through. And I suppose as well, notwithstanding what Richard said about etiquette, if there's something that I've explained and I've explained it badly, please post a comment in the comments box, and then Richard or someone can stop me and say, could you, re-explain that or answer it? Because I'd rather, if I don't explain something well, I'd rather it was picked up rather than the people just were polite about it. So what is a pond? Well, actually, this is quite a difficult subject. I mean, here's a pond, right? And I think everyone would agree that's a pond. Nice classic farmland pond. Seems like pretty good quality, nice fringing edge. You've got some sort of floating plants. You've got some areas of open water. No problem with that. What about this? This is Bosheston Lakes in Pembrokeshire, or Bosheston Lily Ponds, depending on who's giving them the name. Functionally, these are quite similar. These have got sort of areas of marginal thing. They're a little bit bigger in area. They've got quite extensive water lily beds. They're pretty shallow though. You could say these are ponds. Here's a bit of course Bedelio. This is one of the Anglesey fens in winter. Now, most people wouldn't say this is a pond, but if you actually look, it's flooded, and you can see here you've got quite a lot of aquatic plants growing. You've got Potamogeton, which is aquatic. You've got Cara, which is aquatic, stoneworts. And I haven't sampled these, but I have no doubt whatsoever that there are various aquatic organisms swimming around in there and doing their thing. So you could say that this is a pond, although I think most NVC people would say that this is some fen community of some sort. This is cool. This was taken as an NNR in Dorset called Valley of Stones. And it is what it says on the tin, basically. It's a valley which has some quite large glacial erratics on it. And one of these glacial erratic stones had quite a large sort of pit in it. And, well, I'll say large, I mean, it's the pit is probably about, I don't know, 15, 20 centimetres across, something like that. And you can see in the bottom, there's this organic debris accumulated. And in fact, there's a whole load of little ostracods, which are little crustaceans living in there, a whole swarm of them there. So you can see this is its own sort of mini pond as well. It's tiny, it's probably about 1 litre in volume, but there's an ecosystem going on in there. So what is a pond then? What definitions are there? Well, the sort of commonest one is this one, which is a purely area-based one, which is basically area of water smaller than a lake, often artificially made. Well, how big is a lake? Well, we don't really know. The Ramsar Convention thinks it's anything above 8 hectares. The Freshwater Habitats Trust says it's anything between 1 metre squared and 2 hectares. So this is quite an unsatisfactory definition. And of course, area of water is not really an ecological definition, because it doesn't say anything about how deep it is or what's its origin or anything else. Bodies of water where light penetrates to the bottom of the water body. Well, again, that's not entirely satisfactory. It kind of, I mean, it depends on water clarity as well. So there are some ponds where the light doesn't penetrate to the bottom of the water body because they're very muddy or they've got an algal bloom. So there's problems with that kind of definition as well. And there are some lakes that are very clear that could be 5 or 6 meters deep, and maybe tens of hectares in size, where light does penetrate to the bottom. Bodies of water which lack wave action on the shoreline. Well, yeah, okay, but I don't know how you'd measure that really. Holds water for at least 4 months of the year. Water bodies which without fish. That's quite a nice ecological one, although quite a lot of small fish like to live in ponds. This is the one I like the most, although again it's very hard to measure. It's a body of water dominated by edge effects. And I think that kind of picks up on the ecological process, that there's a very strong interaction here between ponds and the surrounding terrestrial ecosystem. And I think we'll come back to that a little bit later, because it shows up in the ecology of ponds. So I think basically, well, what it comes down to is you've got some manner of small, shallow water body that may be temporary or permanent, but it's pretty hard to define exactly what that is. And I think it's quite useful to understand that in the context of thinking about ponds. I should say as well, it would be quite nice to have a bit more of a pond typology and a bit more of an overall understanding of what pond ecosystems are. And maybe that's a challenge for scientists over the next few years. So I think it could really help to advance the conservation of ponds. So this happens in gardens too. I mean, obviously here's my garden pond, or one of my garden ponds when I first put it in, and that's unquestionably a pond, and it was designed in that way. But there's lots of other freshwater habitats around the garden that are loosely ponds, and certainly that are used by pond animals. This probably doesn't reflect my garden in the best light, it has to be said. But it's, as you can see, there are habitats like water butts, gutters. I'm sure that unless you clean your gutters very assiduously, you probably have some sort of leaf litter in there, and that's going to trap some water. And then there are various buckets and things that get left around the garden for various lengths of time. This one is quite interesting, actually. This one here, I've been cleaning out some old aquariums, and just put the soil from the bottom of them in that bucket and left it out, thinking I'll clean it up later. I had to go off and do something else. And then we had 2 weeks of rain, and it filled up with water. And then first we had quite a big algal bloom in it, and it was literally frothing with algae. It was so green, and now it's completely clear. And the reason for that is that a bunch of mosquito larvae, not the biting kind, have appeared in there. The adults have obviously turned up, laid their eggs in there, and they've completely eaten all the algae. So yeah, it's surprising how many ponds you have in your garden when you look. And even if you don't think you have a garden pond, you probably have somewhere where freshwater life that also uses ponds is living. And these are worth looking at as well, and looking for biodiversity. However, ponds are in trouble. They're often not shown on OS maps. Historically, they've been rather neglected by the conservation agencies. They're not very well reflected in habitat classifications. There's no specific phase 1 category for ponds, for example. And they're not usually designated as SSSI features. So we tend to have a little bit of a blind spot, I think, for ponds, and that's a shame, because they're incredibly biodiverse, and I think that's something that we need to find a way to fix within our the way we manage our habitats. Nevertheless, as every school child knows, ponds are really nice for wildlife. They're really good. The number of ponds has also declined dramatically due to different farming practices. There's not really the same need for ponds in the kind of farms that we have now, and so they often tend to get filled in. And the remaining ponds tend to be poor in various studies carried out by the Freshwater Habitats Trust. 80% plus around England and Wales have been in poor condition. I think it's probably a bit lower than that in Wales. But still a lot of them are not in a good state, and they tend to be, it's the same thing as happens with a lot of terrestrial habitats. They tend to be either overgrazed or undergrazed. There isn't that nice kind of happy medium which gets the really nice biodiversity. Now, one thing with ponds is how incredibly diverse they are. This is this slide helps to, I think, bring this together. And in fact, that while there aren't more species in ponds than terrestrially, the higher level of diversity, biodiversity, is definitely greater, because you have all these great groups, these sort of great obscure groups that maybe you've heard of and maybe you haven't, but they don't really occur in freshwater on land. So you have cnidarians, you have little things like hydra, little anemone relatives. Obviously, fish don't occur on land. You have bryozoans, moss animals. Most of these are marine, but some of them you get in ponds. They're probably not in your garden pond. Dragonflies, well, obviously they have totally aquatic larvae. They couldn't live if it wasn't for ponds. Same thing with amphibians. You have sponges. There are some freshwater sponges. Again, most people will think of sponges as something that's marine and maybe tropical, that occurs on coral reefs and things, but actually you get some really quite magnificent sponges in ponds, although again, maybe not so much in your garden pond. They tend to like larger bodies of water because they're filter feeders, and so they need to have quite a lot of water to filter. Rotifers, these are something that you can probably find in your gutter. If you get a bit of, even if it's completely dried out, if you get a bit of silt from your gutter and stick it in a bowl of water, so the rotifers, they can insist and they will hatch out and they'll start crawling around. If you look under a microscope, you'll see them around the place. There are also different kinds of rotifers that you'll get in a garden pond. Tardigrades, water bears as they're also known. This is another obscure group of multicellular animals. They're really small, again, about the same size as rotifers, so they're well under 1 millimeter in size. But tardigrades are something you don't need a scanning. This is a scanning electron micrograph, by the way. This is not using a normal microscope, but you don't need one to see them. You can see them quite easily under a normal dissecting microscope. Again, these are something that will occur in your gutter and almost certainly in your pond as well. Bivalves, this is a pea mollusk, Pisidium. Again, quite a common freshwater organism. Stoneworts, water fleas. We'll hear a lot more about water fleas later on. These are very, very important in your garden pond, and you should aim to have a lot of them. Chironomids as well. These are a kind of fly larva. These are very, very important in freshwaters. Very biodiverse group, and also very numerous usually in most freshwaters. Flatworms. Unless you're from New Zealand, you shouldn't be having flatworms. Here, obviously, we have a few terrestrial flatworms now, but we'd rather not. Leeches, caddis larvae, and of course, mayflies. So there's this spectacular biodiversity of things that, by and large, you don't get terrestrially. And so the first thing you need to be doing when you're looking at a pond and you're trying to identify something, you can't instantly put it into a category and say, oh yeah, I need to get it's a such and such. I need to I need to sort of get my guide to flies or butterflies or whatever. There is straight away a lot higher diversity of things, and you need to have that sort of understanding of it. There's also different types of more familiar groups. There's fly larvae as well, of course, Water spider, this is a cool animal. I'll come back to this as well, but this is a beautiful thing. And it's fairly common in weedy ponds, but it's the sort of thing that's very easy to overlook because it looks like a fairly regular spider when you fish it out of water. And it's something that it's only obvious that it's a water spider really when you let it go, because all the other spiders, you quite often catch spiders when you go pond dipping and they'll sit in your net and then you let them go. And obviously they'll run along the surface of the water because they don't want to drown. Water spiders dive straight in. and then you realize you had a water spider. They have this beautiful, this sort of grayish body which is covered in hairs, and it traps air. Again, I'll talk a bit more about this. These are those midge larvae. Remember that bucket I showed you earlier? These are those midge larvae that were getting it clear. They're larvae of a mosquito called Culex. This isn't a one that bites, but they're pretty good filter feeders, and they will certainly introduce themselves to anywhere that doesn't have too many predators. Here's a predatory midge larva. This is Chaoborus. It's another non-biting midge, and these things are quite scary. They're about a centimetre or two long, transparent, and it has these kind of fang-like projections at the front. And that's pretty much what they are. They basically will hang in the water and they'll catch other things that go past, particularly things like water fleas. And then, of course, you've got snails. There's a pond snail, Limnia stagnalis, great pond snail. There's lots of species of pond snails. There's something rather bovine about pond snails, I think. They have sort of slow, cow-like, placid sort of movement. These are pretty important in ponds as well. And if you don't have any, I actually would recommend that you introduce some, because they're very, very useful to help maintain a balance in ponds. So just moving through, I just thought initially I'd start on the water surface of ponds, just to think about some of the things that you live there. Obviously, these are some of the most conspicuous, because when you walk up to a pond, these are the first things you see by and large. And everyone knows a pond skater, right? I mean, they don't really need much introduction. There's a number of species of them. This is the commonest one, Geris. And it's, I mean, these are amazing things. They will very often turn up, if you're putting in a new garden pond, they'll often turn up as you're filling it up. Literally, they seem to be flying around the place. And if you're there in the summertime, you'll often see a pond skater or two land before you actually, before you've actually completed filling it up. And these are basically, as are all these three species, specializing in catching other insects that fall into water. It's amazing actually that in sort of 200 odd million years of evolution, insects don't seem to have developed the ability to avoid falling into water with monotonous regularity. And anyway, all of these things prey on these, as you can see with this water measurer here. The two bugs here have these long proboscis with which they suck the juices, and the whirligigs will just crunch them up. Pond skaters are the most sort of general. Whirligigs you'll get usually as well if you have a fairly open pond with lots of open water. They don't like, they're quite active beetles. They don't seem to like being cramped by lots of pond weeds or shading or whatever. So these tend to be things that you'll lose if you have a very overgrown sort of pond. Whirligigs are really interesting. You can see it in this photo. There's a beautiful photo from the Biological Museum Lund. These actually literally have 4 eyes. Well, they don't really have 4 eyes because they're four compound eyes, which are compound eyes made of hundreds of eyes. But you can see here, there's one eye there, there's another eye on the opposite side, and then down there, there's another one. And there's another one on the other side. If you think about that, the reason for this is that whirligigs are swimming literally through the surface film. They have 2 eyes to look up for danger and 2 eyes to look below for danger. What actually happened evolutionarily is that the eyes, each compound eye, split over time, and so now they've completely separated out. But amazing things, and you know, it's extraordinary some of the things evolution comes up with. This is a water measurer. This is something that you'll get generally in very overgrown ponds. Very slender, slow-moving things. They don't need orange water, by the way. This one just seems to be rather iron-rich water. And you can see they're quite small and slender. That's a springtail at its core there. Some other things that you're very likely to see around a pond are dragonflies. These are usually find their way very effectively to new ponds. And these are probably the 6 most likely to arrive at a garden pond. There's obviously quite a number of other species that occur in Britain. I saw Alan's on the call, and he'll have the sort of chapter and verse on what's around the place. But many of those require slightly different habitats. I mean, there are things like emperor dragonfly or four-spotted chaser that may occur if you have a particularly big garden pond. But generally speaking, for the average size garden pond, I would say these 6 are the things that in my experience, you tend to get the most. And you can get really quite surprising numbers. I mean, things like southern hawker, which is quite a big dragonfly and it produces a big nymph. You can get hundreds of larvae in your pond, and those have quite a profound effect on the ecosystem. These things, broad-bodied chasers, very common. You're probably familiar with these if you've got a pond. They're extremely territorial, and you'll often get a male will take ownership of your pond and will engage in dog fights with absolutely anything else that comes nearby. It can be very aggressive. Here are the larvae. You may not be as familiar with the larvae. These are quite large things. This is Echina cyania. This is the larva of this southern hawker that I just referred to. And you can see, I mean, these will get to, I don't know, about 6 centimeters or so long. They're quite a hefty beast. They don't move around much. They're an ambush predator. And you can see they have this extraordinary extensible jaw, which you can see here. I've captured this one and just sort of unfolded its jaw there. And they flick this out to catch prey. So things like tadpoles, mayfly nymphs, anything that it feels that it can handle. These are also quite extraordinary because they're able to, in an emergency, try and escape from predators by using jet propulsion. They kind of squeeze water out of their rectum. And so you can see that they sort of suddenly will move off in a series of sort of rather jerky movements. Excuse me. Right, bugs. There are a lot of bugs that in fresh waters, and these are another thing that is very conspicuous. The two that you're most likely to come across are, well, it depends what you want to call them. I've called this one back swimmer because it's the easiest way to remember it. They're also called greater water boatmen. These are large, active predators, spend a lot of time floating at the surface, and you'll see why that is in a minute. You can see they sort of basically row themselves around on their back with their large hind legs, and they use their sort of sucking proboscis to suck the fluids out of prey. The other species is, there's a number of species. The other group are the lesser water boatmen, Coryxids, their family Coryxidae. This is Coryxa punctata. But there's quite a number of species, and I have to say I haven't attempted to identify the species that I've got in my garden pond. These are detritus feeders, and you often get quite a lot of them. They're smaller than back swimmers, and they tend to be much more active. They scoot around on the bottom, sort of hoovering things up. If you are lucky, you may come across some of these slightly more spectacular species. So this one here is Iliacorus sinusoides. It looks a little bit like a water beetle at first sight. It's a sort of fairly roundish thing. It likes a sort of shallow, warm, weedy ponds, and it's rather a southern species. So if you're based in South Wales, I'd say you have a better chance of finding it than up here. I've not seen it up here. And then there are these 2 water scorpions. There's this the regular water scorpion, which is, you can see why it's named that for fairly obvious reasons. It doesn't sting, but it's sort of these two are also ambush predators. They have these long claws which they use to catch prey, and again, the standard sucking beak that bugs have. There are actually some giant versions of this that you get in the tropics, the bellostomatid bugs, and they get to like that kind of size, the sort of, kind of 6 inches long. They're absolutely terrifying insects, really, really very large. The biggest bug we have, I think in Britain actually, is the water stick insect, Renatra linearis. This is long and skinny. You can see why it's called a stick insect, but unlike stick insects, it's another predator, as I think is fairly obvious. It's maybe water praying mantis might be slightly better name for it. This definitely does occur in North Wales. It's another southern species, but I found it on Anglesey in the Anglesey Fens. I've never seen it in a garden pond, but we live a bit high up. It's possible that it might come and exploit your pond if it's a bit overgrown and weedy. They tend to like those kind of habitats. So definitely one worth watching out for, and it's completely unmistakable as well. Water beetles. If you get the design of your pond right, you can expect to have quite a lot of water beetles. And there are lots of different species. Unfortunately, the commoner ones tend not to be very easy to identify. This is a gabus, by the way, which is mentioned in the title of the talk. It's a common black water beetle, but there's another one, genus called Elibius. I couldn't find a nice picture of it, unfortunately, which looks very, very similar. And really, you need to, a lot of these, you need to be able to examine them in detail to get an accurate identification. This one is called Acilius sulcatus. It's a sort of another medium-sized water beetle, rather beautiful gold striping on it. And it likes a sandy bottom, and which means I've come across it quite often in garden ponds if you give them that right substrate. This is a delightful little thing called Hyphidrus ovatus. It's only I don't know, about 5 or 6 millimeters long, but as the name implies, it's very ovate. It's very sort of rounded, like a sort of maize seed or something like that. It's got a very plump sort of appearance to it, and quite a chestnutty red colour as it swims through the water, so very distinctive. But really, if we're talking about water beetles, I mean, there's obviously rarities like things like the great silver water beetle, which you may or may not come across, but you'd be very lucky. But this guy is definitely something that you may well come across in your garden pond. And again, this is, well, it's not quite as big as a stag beetle, but it's one of Britain's largest beetles, and very, very spectacular. You can get an idea of the scale of it from the hand there that's holding it. And these will turn up. I've had them a couple of times in the garden pond. They don't tend to form populations, but they'll come along, lay some eggs, and you get some larvae, and then for whatever reason, they'll move off again. They really are beautiful insects, and it's well worth taking the time to look at them. But they're also pretty scary. For a lot of pond organisms, these are voracious predators, and for a lot of pond organisms, that's the last view they might ever get. Now, there is one thing that is scarier than a great diving beetle, and that is a great diving beetle larva, which is, frankly, for its size, is possibly the most terrifying predator in Britain. These things can get to the size of a smooth newt, so they're pretty large, and I would say that's about the size of this one here. They have, at their forehead, they have this pair of very, very sharp, curved mandibles through which they inject digestive juices. So they will grab at anything that moves, and that includes people or fish or anything. They're not very choosy as to size, just anything moving, they have a whack with it. And then they will then inject this digestive juice into it. And if it's anything, certainly if it's anything that's about the size of the larva or smaller, that will kill it very rapidly, and then it will suck up the resulting soup. These are not at all choosy, and they're pretty cannibalistic as well, which probably is a good thing because it helps to keep the numbers down. Otherwise, I don't think you have much left in your pond if you get some going. But nonetheless, they are they are part of the tapestry of the pond, and I wouldn't be without them, actually. I don't do anything about them when I see them around the place. And finally, of course, I mean, these are the things we love to see in a pond, or certainly these are the things that I love to see, are amphibians. There's 6 species in Wales. Obviously, one of them is natterjack toads, which you won't get in your garden pond. But the other 5 species, yeah, depending on where exactly you live, you stand a pretty good chance of getting them coming to visit, and of using the pond pretty much all year round. Even outside the spawning season, if you go there at night time with a torch, you can usually see the odd frog coming and having a drink, particularly in hot weather. Toads seem to use garden ponds very, very effectively. Palmate newts, common and widespread all over Wales, and I'm sure you're all familiar with these. And then, if you're lucky as well, if you live in the right areas, you may also get smooth newts and great crested newts. And certainly one of the best ponds I've ever come across for great crested newts was on a B&B, which was also a sort of a farm. It was I don't think it was a terribly working farm, and they had this extremely muddy pond there, which was, and I at the time I had my pond net with me, and I stuck my net in it just out of curiosity, and came up with about 20 crested newts. So certainly they can you can get quite large numbers in the right areas. So I'm going to move on now a little bit into pond ecology, thinking about how ponds work, what factors we need to think about when we are designing them, and also managing them. And I'm going to think about 3 different things in particular. There are obviously other things that you can talk about, but I think the three key factors are oxygen, plankton, and by plankton I mean the balance between the phytoplankton and the zooplankton. So there's sort of the planktonic algae that turn the water green, and the things that are eating them. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about blanketweed, filamentous algae, that kind of rather scummy algae that you see floating on ponds as well, which tends to be regarded as a bit of a nuisance. So, oxygen. There's a lot of things to say about oxygen, but I think in terms of water, oxygen doesn't move naturally through water very easily. So basically, you need to get the water to move and to turn over, and that tends to happen most efficiently through wind and through rain in general. Now, shallower ponds will have a larger surface area to volume ratio, so they're going to find it easier to be well oxygenated than deep ponds, because obviously in a deep pond you tend to get, not only do you get a lower surface area to volume ratio, you'll also get sort of a bit of a sump area at the bottom where it's harder to move the water to. Now, ponds are naturally quite low in oxygen, and many pond animals can cope with that. They have evolved various mechanisms, and we'll go through some of those in a minute. Rotting material. If you have a lot of things living in your pond, and in particular if you have a lot of rotting material, usually rotting leaves, but maybe you have other stuff, that will increase bacterial populations, and that can deoxygenate the water quite rapidly. So this is something to be aware of when managing ponds. You don't really want too much leafy material. Again, some leafy material is a good thing, and a lot of things like to feed on it, but you don't want too much of it. Pond plants, so-called oxygenators, they do produce oxygen by day, and in fact you can often see bubbles coming out, which is great, but they do also consume oxygen at night, and because they have a lot of structure, they are reducing the opportunity for water movement. So they're a bit of a double-edged sword, and you need to be a little bit careful and maybe think about how much of them you necessarily want to have. You don't have to have any at all, of course. And finally, if you think about floating plants like duckweed and water lilies, they can look pretty, but they reduce the effective surface area of the pond. Every square centimetre that is covered by a water lily leaf isn't exchanging any oxygen at all, and they're also reducing any water movement. So if you have a lot of those on your pond, the water underneath is likely to be quite deoxygenated. Now, as I said, things can have various mechanisms to cope with these kind of situations. So here's the water scorpion that we saw earlier. The scorpion's tail is actually a snorkel, and these tend to hang down from the surface of the water, stick their snorkel up through the water surface film, and breathe air that way. So that's nice and easy. This is another thing, unrelated, that does the exact same thing. This is the larva of Aristeas tenax, a hoverfly species, and it's aquatic, and it has this sort of snorkel tail, and for that reason it's often called the rat-tailed maggot. These tend to be found in very, very oxygen-poor water. So if you have rat-tailed maggots in your pond, it's probable that you've got a bit of an oxygen problem. Aqualungs. This is a strategy used by quite a lot of beetles and bugs in particular. This is the lesser water boatman photo we saw earlier. You can see all this silvering around the wing cases. This is the result of, this is an air bubble, and it's an air bubble that's being trapped by special hairs. You'll see them come to the surface periodically to take on a little bit more oxygen, and then they'll dive down again. But these often will carry really quite a lot of air around them, and they also gain a little bit because that air bubble will diffuse. It's a little bit of extra surface. It'll get a little bit of oxygen exchange from the water around it as well. Here's a diving beetle. This is actually a great silver water beetle, and you can see it's doing the same thing. There's this silvery covering here, which is trapped oxygen, and you've got again an area which allows it to breathe, and periodically they'll come to the surface, and all diving beetles will do that. And this is the coolest thing. This is a water spider, and these are just amazing. These actually make their own diving bells. They're such a unique organism. They'll actually dive down. They'll spin a silk web under the water, and then they'll make a few trips to the surface and bring down some air on their abdomen, and they'll fill this diving bell with air, and that basically enables the spider to pootle around underwater without having to go to the surface as much, because it can go back to its diving bell instead, to its home. So I mean, these are really an amazing aquatic organism, and it's really an extraordinary example of how something that is terrestrial and can't breathe underwater has managed to nonetheless find a way to survive in a freshwater environment. This is these are some of the most dramatic ways of saving oxygen. I suppose one way is if you're like a dragonfly larva, you just don't do a lot of things. And quite a lot of dragonfly larvae, in fact most of them, are very inactive, and so they don't move around a lot, and so they can survive by using very little oxygen. But a slightly more sophisticated way of doing it is with some of these worms that live in the bottom of ponds in oxygen poor environments. This is Tubifex, which is a kind of annelid related to earthworms. And these are bloodworms. This is a kind of chironomid species. I'm afraid I don't know which one. But you see both of them are bright red. And the reason they're bright red is they have lots of extra hemoglobin, which will help to absorb more oxygen, even in very oxygen poor environments. And then finally, you have this, which is the most extreme thing to do. These are purple sulfur bacteria. This pond has a very bad, I don't know why, but it has a really bad oxygen problem because it's sort of purpley pink. And the reason for this is that instead of using oxygen as a means of breathing, these are using sulfur. So they're using sulfur that is actually in the environment and releasing, instead of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide when they breathe out. So this pond, now for these things, oxygen is actually toxic. So these things this pond must be almost completely deoxygenated to have this. Now, you can see purple sulfur bacteria sometimes in garden ponds. I used to have a little garden pond, which is now gone. It was completely full of water lilies, tiny little pond. And if you looked under the water lily leaves and just stirred up the base of it, you would see these kind of purplish colonies coming up. And these were purple sulfur bacteria. So definitely when you have very little water movement and not much gas exchange with the surface, you can get this as well in your own pond. And maybe some of you have them, I don't know. So here's a interesting little bit of research. This is from the work of Professor Carl Sayer at University College London and his research group. This is sort of showing the value of what happens for biodiversity when you improve the oxygenation of some of these ponds. So here's an example. This is what was nicknamed Sayer's Black Pit. These are all ponds in Norfolk. And as you can see, for fairly obvious reason, a lot of ponds in Norfolk are very overgrown with trees. They tend to be surrounded by arable land. The farmers don't really have a use for the ponds. They don't necessarily fill them in, they just leave them, and you get tree growth coming over the top, lots of leaf fall coming into them, and of course not much wind action either. And so as you can see from this graph, basically red means very little oxygen, blue means a lot of oxygen, and purple is sort of in between. And then this represents different depths of the pond. Most of the pond water for most of the year is pretty much deoxygenated. So in November 2011, the project cleared it out. They cut back all the trees and desludged it. You can see there's a lot of this anoxic black sludge coming out here. And in June 2013, 17 species of dragonfly have been recorded, 4 species of breeding amphibians, and lots of different plants as well. Here's some pondweed, Possum-Eaton, which has presumably come from the seed bank. And this isn't a pattern that's just due to one pond as well. You can see the same general thing happening. You've got these rather poorly oxygenated ponds. There's a different colour scheme, I'm afraid. And then you remove the tree cover and that overshading, and you suddenly see a big increase in oxygen concentrations. And with that, you open up the pond, and from relatively low taxon richness, you suddenly get a lot more species. You get more amphibians as well. If you've got high tree cover, you get fewer, you're less likely to have amphibians using the pond compared to ponds with lower tree cover. And most strikingly, I think, are the numbers, because these ponds, these unmanaged ponds here, have very low numbers of insects emerging from them, whereas these ponds that have been managed, that have received that treatment that you saw before, suddenly have between 10 to 100 times as many insects coming out of them. So that's massively better for biodiversity. And it isn't just the ponds that benefit from that, they're much better for terrestrial species as well. Terrestrial species will obviously come and use these ponds. Species like bats and birds will forage at them. You'll get wildflowers coming next to them as well. So these are the overgrown, unmanaged ponds. These are pollinators. And if you have either long-term pond management or it's been restored, you suddenly get far more higher pollinator abundance. So they're almost doubled. And for birds as well, the story is the same. Unmanaged ponds, you get rather low numbers of birds, and I suspect those are probably woodland birds that are hanging around in the actual copse rather than anything to do with the pond. And then you get almost double the species richness of birds. So what about plankton and water quality, clarity? This is obviously something of concern. It's been very much in the news this year for various reasons. We've had quite a large drought, and that's stimulated quite a lot of algal blooms. Of course, algae are a natural part of the ecosystem, and lots of things eat algae. So ponds need algae. Saying that we don't want algae is a bit like saying we don't want plants in terrestrial environments. You can obviously have too much of a good thing, but you do need them. And then they can occur on very large scales. Here's an algal bloom that's occurring off Devon and Cornwall in the sea. And again, this is driving the whole marine ecosystem. And here's a rather murky looking pond, but again, this is in Norfolk from Carl Sayers' work. Well, what are phytoplankton? It's worth, I mean, these have a biodiversity too, right? These aren't just algae. And again, this is a whole course in itself, and I'm certainly not qualified to do this. These are, I'll just say, I mean, these are very biodiverse. They're more biodiverse than a lot of the terrestrial groups we go through. For example, these here, this is Microcystis. This is a cyanobacteria. It's actually nothing to do with any of these other algae, which are quite unrelated groups. This is, so these first two here, these are diatoms. These are very widespread. They have a silica shell, and they are very useful for a subject called paleolimnology, which is in lakes. You can push down cores into the mud at the bottom of a lake, and you can look at the remains of the different diatom species, these silica shells, to work out what the ecology was like in the past. So these are very useful for scientists, and they're really beautiful as well. I mean, these are lovely things. This is chlorella. This is a very common alga used in cultures, in labs, but also very common in the wild. This extraordinary thing here is called Volvox. It's a colonial alga. You can just about see it with the naked eye. It's about, these colonies are about 0.5 millimeter in diameter. And if you stick it under the light microscope, this is the kind of thing that you can see. It tends to occur in summertime in quite well-established ponds, and it's quite good at surviving where there's quite heavy grazing pressure, because it's able to, it's a bit too big for a lot of the sort of water fleas and things to eat. This is a desmid called Microsterius. You're likely to come across this if you take some samples from some rather peaty ponds, maybe in the uplands. It's another beautiful, beautiful alga. And this one here, this blue-green, maybe it's another very lovely thing under the microscope, but maybe not so keen on it. This is one of the toxic species of blue-green algae that you can get in blooms, and maybe wouldn't want to have it in your garden pond, but you're also unlikely to get it unless you have very high nutrient levels. Well, going after these things are some equally marvellous biodiversity, the zooplankton. The most important of these are these water fleas here, these cladocerans. Daphnia, a pretty well-known name, but I don't know how many of you will have looked at Daphnia under a microscope and seen it. These are extraordinary things. They have these brush-like legs, which they use for trapping algae and conveying it to the mouth. You can see there's a gut here, which is green because it's eating algae, obviously. And these reproduce at a phenomenal rate. You can see these are, they're mostly female, and they will produce lots of eggs all the time. They're very, very efficient grazers of algae, particularly these larger species. This is another smaller cladoceran called Bosmina. This is a rotifer, it's a planktonic rotifer called Brachionus. You're quite likely to find this in your pond. It's another multicellular organism swimming around, same sort of idea, eats lots of algae. And then this is a copepod species, another crustacean, and it has one eye, and so of course it's called Cyclops. I love some of the Latin names of these things. So how do these work? Well, you can think of it as a sort of, you know, I know it's a bit hackneyed to talk about ecological balance and so forth, but you can think of it in these terms fairly effectively. And it's worth starting off. Obviously, you have an aquatic ecosystem, you have some sunlight, and you have a little bit of nutrients. You don't need much nutrients to get things going, and you get algae growing, and off they go. Then obviously you get a predator turn up and eat them, and by and large these are very, very efficient. And if you have just a normal water butt or something like that with some Daphnia in it, these will suppress algal growth until the end of the world. they are extraordinarily good at grazing algae, and under those kind of circumstances. However, there are things that can disrupt this. If you get some very hot, dry weather and the algae can grow quicker, they can get a little bit out of hand. Fish love to eat water fleas. And so, in fact, lots of other things in the ponds love to eat water fleas as well. So if you have a lot of predators, then that will start to push things back towards the algae again. So you tend to get more turbid water. Fish also have but what fish are basically doing actually is they're converting water fleas into nutrients. So they're doing various things that are not so good for the ecosystem. They convert water fleas into nutrients, more algae, and they also like to root around in the bottom of the pond and stir up the mud, which is more nutrients again, which is more algae. And obviously if you've got nutrients anyway coming into your pond from somewhere else, it's not terribly likely in a garden pond, but it can happen. I don't know if your pond gets run off from the lawn or so, or the vegetable patch or something like that, then that is also going to tend to tip the scales in the direction of the phytoplankton. On the other hand, you have other things that work in the opposite direction. So you also have water plants. And if you have submerged water plants, those are very good at sucking up nutrients and competing basically with the phytoplankton for the sunlight and for nutrients. They provide a bit of shading, and they also provide a bit of cover for these grazers to hide from the fish, if you've got any fish. So it's quite a complex situation, but fundamentally it's about thinking about the balance between these, and then some of these other factors that will affect it. So let's go back to this pond here that I showed you. This was it in May 2014. Now this is quite an interesting one. This is part of Carl Sayer's work as well. And this was a so-called ghost pond. This was a pond that had been filled in or had filled in naturally. But you can still see these ghost ponds in aerial photographs from above. And so if you go to those and re-excavate those, it's quite a good place to dig a pond. You know, there was a pond there in the past. And also, that means if there was a pond there in the past, there will quite often be spores and resting bodies of various aquatic organisms there. And so you may find that you get good germination of things, and it'll settle down quicker. So this was it in May 2014. This is really an example of new pond syndrome. You dig a hole, you get some nutrients coming in, you get a load of algae. By June, it was looking very different. The water had cleared quite, so it's not very clear on this photo, but you can see the water isn't as soupy as it was before. But on the other hand, there's quite a lot of blanket weed. There's quite a lot of this sort of filamentous algae, which isn't great looking either. By July, that blanket weed's gone too. And you can't really, again, you can't really see it that well, but you can see the water is fairly clear. And actually you've got a good growth here of this stuff, which are stoneworts. They're a kind of complex algae, I suppose in simple terms, they're kind of good algae, and that tend to prefer clean water. And then by September, you've got a whole bunch of aquatic plants have started growing as well. And you've got huge swarms of all these little dots here that you can see are water fleas, which we've been talking about. So you've got the kind of balance that we were talking about earlier. You've got these plants which are sucking up nutrients. You've got water fleas which are grazing the phytoplankton. And you've really got a very nice looking pond. Now it's worth at this point saying a little bit about filamentous algae. These look very unsightly, and they're a bit of a fact of life in garden ponds. I think you're likely to get them cropping up at different points in garden ponds, unless they are very shaded. And my feeling about these is that provided you don't let them get to this kind of state, that really they are probably not that much of a problem. The key thing really is not to have too high nutrient levels, and you can also scoop them out if you're worried about the concentration, you know, about the amount of it. You can also scoop them out a little bit with a net, and they don't tend to grow back that fast. However, they are an important food source, and it's probably better to have these than to have green soup. So on the whole, I think they get a slightly bad press. They're also free oxygenators. I mean, this is a photograph of my garden pond taken about 4 weeks ago when we had a bit of sunshine. And this is just the bed of it. There's a sandy bed, and you can see there's lots of, there's a sort of film of filamentous algae growing here. And you can see the whole bed is covered with oxygen bubbles. It's quite striking. And this is all algal production. So that's a good thing. And in fact, in this case, by the end of the day, they produced so much oxygen they floated to the surface. It was quite an extraordinary sight, and they sunk again during the night. It was it's very interesting, some of the things that can go on. But of course, your aquatic submerged plants are also very important, and getting those right is also a good thing. And of course, if you get aquatic submerged plants, those will compete with your filamentous algae. They'll never quite get rid of them. You can see here there's a bit of a tangle going on of the filamentous algae and the submerged plants. But in general, if you can get a mixture of those, you should be able to get a fairly stable pond that looks good. The other thing that's worth noting here are snails. Snails are not your friend in most of the garden, or they're certainly not my friend. But in a pond, they definitely are. And this is because pond snails don't eat plants, or they don't eat vascular plants in ponds very much. Pond snails mostly eat algae. And because algae are much nicer to eat. And you can see the extent of that because you've got algae growing on the snail's shell, which is, I suppose, is an area that doesn't get grazed very much otherwise. But other areas are being kept quite clean. Pond snails are something that I would encourage you to have. They also help to keep algae from overgrowing your submerged pond plants. So I think these are quite an important part of the ecosystem. And although they can breed quite a lot, they're doing so in response to food supply. So that's a little bit about pond ecosystems and ecology. I'll now think about pond design and construction, and what we can do to get ponds being the best possible for wildlife. So I suppose the number one thing I'll start off with is the premise that we're not having fish, I'm afraid. So Goldie here is getting short shrift. Fish, as we've said, have a big ecological impact. They will eat lots of your water fleas. They'll eat lots of other wildlife as well. They eat tadpoles, they'll eat newt larvae, they'll eat all sorts of things. If you want a goldfish pond, that's great. I mean, you know, by all means, but it will have a lot less value for wildlife. So I'm kind of working for the assumption that we're not looking at goldfish ponds, and certainly not koi ponds, which are worse. I might let you off with a few sticklebacks though. These are quite sweet, actually. The stickleback's a lovely little fish, and maybe I'll make a stickleback pond at some time. They have an amazing behaviour, and the males are beautiful in their breeding coloration. You can see the eyes turn bright blue, and they build a little nest. Fascinating to watch. So, you know, sticklebacks maybe get a bit underrated. So you'll get a lot of helpful pond conservation advice, I expect. Some of you may listen to Gardener's Question Time, and you'll probably hear various people giving you lots of advice, which tends to be handed down from generation to generation. So ponds must be at least 70 centimetres deep. They need at least 30% shading from water lilies or other floating leaf plants. They mustn't dry out. You need to plant in baskets. You need a shelf. And you need oxygenating plants. And so what you will end up with, and I apologise for my artwork here, this is partly because I can't draw, and partly because the clip art or sort of opportunities here, or the sketching tools on PowerPoint are quite limited. So this is the sort of design of pond that you're likely to end up with if you follow that advice. So you get water lilies providing some cover and shade. You'll get a bunch of oxygenators such as Eladia. I'm sorry about this, you'll just have to use your imaginations. You might get some emergents to add a bit of interest and cover. You'll get an area of deep water, which is cool in summer and is ice-free in winter. You get a plastic baskets that you plant into, that contains growth. And you get quite a large area of bare liner. Now, there are problems with this design. You've got water lilies, that's reducing your surface area for oxygen exchange, which we talked about. Eladia, which tends to be the submerged plant, which is usually introduced, is an invasive species problem. And what you'll probably find out is that this Eladia will rapidly cover most of this area, which you don't really want it to do. The plants that you put in here may well be another invasive species problem, depending on what you've planted. Some of these marginals can be quite invasive. And the other thing you can often get is you can get things like crassula, which will be sheltering in the base of the pot that you've planted it in. You get little tiny fragments, which don't look much, and then suddenly you'll find you've got another issue there. This kind of design generally has rather steep margins made out of plastic, which can be rather hazardous. They can be easy to fall into, and they're not ideal for wildlife either. They're not very easy for frogs and insects, larvae that need to climb out and pupate to climb in and out of. This deeper area, the fact you've got a shelf here means you have a deeper area as well. And that tends to be a bit of a natural sump, which will accumulate organic matter. And that will start to rot and it'll be deoxygenated. So the water here isn't going to be easy to oxygenate, and this area here is not likely to have much value in practice. Plants in these plastic baskets, in my experience, don't tend to do very well. They tend to do one of two things. They either die, or they will, if they have rather tough rhizomes, they will split the basket, and then they'll start growing all over the rest of the pond. And finally, you have an awful lot of black plastic, usually, which is a pretty poor substrate for any kind of biodiversity, except filamentous algae quite like to grow on it. So this is not ideal. So a different approach, well, firstly, what I'd start doing is putting in a proper substrate, right? Most ponds have a substrate. They don't have black plastic. They have something that plants can grow in all the way through. Things can burrow in it. Things can sort of embed themselves in it. That you can just have a lot more ecology going on. And I tend to find in the ponds that I've made, the best substrate to use here seems to be something like sharp sand or builder's sand. It doesn't seem to contain very much salt. It protects the liner, and lots of things seem to like to live on it. So this is quite an effective thing. It's also quite a good idea maybe to mix in a few bags of aquatic compost just to provide a little bit of organic matter. Otherwise it may be a little bit too nutrient poor. Let your water levels fluctuate naturally. It's fine. I'll show you a bit more about that later. Plants are optional. I'm sorry, this looks like a bit like a carrot, doesn't it? If you're planting plants, generally native plants, you need to get a little bit of rhizome like this with a growing point and weight it down here with a stone, and then let them do their thing and just let them spread to anywhere in the pond. The more I make ponds, the more I think you should be very, very sparing with emergence. It's very easy to plant something that is too vigorous and that goes everywhere. So use mainly dwarf clumping species. Weight root cuttings down with stones initially, otherwise they'll float off, and it's actually very difficult to establish anything that isn't really invasive with the sort of usual method of just lobbing a bunch of something into the pond and hoping for the best. Most of the water in a pond like this will be well oxygenated, and it'll be fairly warm as well. And most pond species actually quite like warm water. Many of those insects like warm water to complete their life cycles. And you've got nice shallow margins. It's fairly safe. You might get wet feet, but you're unlikely to really fall in. You can get colonization by marginal plants and often by mosses as well, which will form a nice little sort of fenny area around the edge. In terms of depth, how deep should your pond be? Well, that really depends on your target species. Fish probably do need some depth to avoid overheating and drying out. And that probably other benefits other species, things like mayflies that can maybe need to have a little bit more complexity. If you're looking at other species, things like frogs and water beetles probably don't need your pond to be very much at all. They'll like something that's shallow and warm. Frogs, I think, would like it to dry out in summer because that reduces predators. They seem to be very, very sensitive to predator accumulation. And so having something that dries out is probably quite good for them. And water plants are surprisingly tolerant, provided the mud doesn't dry out entirely, and I'll show you some photos of that a bit later. In terms of shading, I think we've already seen earlier on what the effects of heavy shade can do. The converse of that, full sun, absolutely fine. You don't need water lilies. They can be a problem to manage as well. And it's a good idea to have the pond where it doesn't receive too much leaf litter, because as you saw, if you have an awful lot of leaf litter in there, it does get deoxygenated. What about submerged plants? I think a problem here is that a lot of the species that you'll see are invasive, and this is a really, really big problem for ponds. And to be quite honest, pond discards are a big problem in the wild as well. If you go, for example, to Talyllyn Lake, that lake is largely full of two invasive species, Elodea nuttallii and Lagorasyphon major, and those have largely elbowed out the native flora. So I would say for ponds, to be on the safe side, in general, stick to natives. Don't impulse buy. If you can get them from a source that you know is good, maybe from your local wildlife trust or something like that, then do that. Wash plants down as well. They could carry invasive invertebrates. Quite a good source of plant. You can actually get water plants from the wild as well. There is a sort of sustainable way to do it, which is if you look at the margins of lakes, particularly in the autumn, you can often find that there has been species that have been washed up on the strand line. The storms in the winter will wash up pieces onto the strand line, and those will just die and rot down. So you're not really having any ecological impact there if you were to collect a few and plant them in your pond, because they would die in any case. So I think that's one way that you could collect wild plants without having any impact. You may also be able to get seed as well that way. Certainly a lot of Potamogeton species, if you have a lake which has a lot of them in there, you can often find on the drift line these quite large sort of pyramidal shaped roughly seeds, and those are Potamogeton seeds, and it's worth trying to grow those. So here's a group of plants that I found are quite easy and quite suitable for growing in garden ponds. Some of my number one ones will be the various broadleaf Potamogeton species. This is a Potamogeton gramineus, which is an example. Actually, that one there is alpinus. There's about 4 or 5 species plus a bunch of hybrids of these. They grow in ponds, lakes, and rivers, and they seem to do quite well in a garden pond, provided that you get a piece of rhizome. And this is something I can't stress enough actually for most aquatic plants, certainly most native aquatic plants. You need to get the roots. And that's sort of something that seems quite obvious in a way, because, you know, who on earth is going to try and get plants going from a piece of stem or a leaf or something? You stand much better chance if you can get some roots. But unfortunately, in sort of aquatic, you know, garden centre culture and so forth, a lot of the invasive species tend to be cultured, and these are things that do quite well, very easy to grow from any kind of fragment. And but obviously, really, the only species that are worth growing are species that that are a little bit more difficult to grow, because then they're less invasive. So these potamogetons, easy to grow. Get a bit of the root, weigh it down, take off most of the foliage. It'll die back if you leave the foliage on. The root will start growing away and will produce new foliage, and they'll produce some quite nice patches. And they're also very ornamental. I think they're very pretty things with a nice white vein here and slightly translucent leaves. They're very beautiful. Bladderworts. These are stunning little plants. They produce these sort of feathery foliage with little traps on, and they eat water fleas. So the traps, the water flea will swim past and trigger the trap, and then it'll suck the water flea in. They also have very, very pretty yellow flowers, which are worth growing for in their own right. Pileolaria. You might be surprised to see me recommending this as an aquatic plant from a garden pond, but you can buy it commercially, believe it or not. You do see it for sale from time to time. It's often marketed as peppergrass. You can see it's Pileolaria though, because you have the little uncurling new fronds that sort of that have that fern-like way of unwrapping. And this is actually pretty vigorous. It's almost too vigorous for a garden pond. It can grow quite explosively, but it's quite a nice little thing, and it doesn't get too enormous. Littorella uniflora. This is a very common plant of particularly upland lakes, but you get it in many lake types actually. And this is very resistant to water level fluctuations. It's not very tall. It only gets to about maybe 10 centimeters tall, but it forms a nice sort of low carpet. And then a couple of species which are more easy to buy. This is hornwort, Somatophyllum demersum. You very commonly see this for sale. Quite an easy thing to grow. It prefers quite high nutrient situations in the wild, but it will cope with lower nutrient situations, as you'll find in ponds. And then Myriophyllum alterniflorum, the alternate water milfoil. You need to be a little bit careful with Myriophyllums. There are quite a number of species, and one of them, the parrot's feather, is invasive. Fortunately, you can tell parrot's feather because it doesn't really grow submerged. These ones that you see, basically the growth of it is completely underwater, except for the flowers, which are coming above. Parrot's feather is kind of the opposite. The stems of that are bare underwater, and then you have these sort of emergent stems with these bushy green leaves. So you can't really mistake it for anything else. There are some native plants that are a bit more difficult in your garden pond as well. I've tried some of these and really not had any success. I would love to get Houghtonia established, for example. The so-called water violet. It's actually in the Primula family. I don't know why it's called violet. It looks nothing like a violet. But it seems to be something that likes, I think, quite, when I've seen it in the wild, it seems to like rather deep, muddy substrates. And I think unless you have a deep, muddy pond, or a pond with sort of deep mud in the garden, I think you'll be rather unlikely to get it established. And it's a pity. It's a very pretty thing. Calitrichae, the water starworts, like similar kinds of situations. And again, I suspect, I've never had any luck with these, and I suspect they'll be rather difficult to get going. Cara, stoneworts, which we already saw a little bit earlier in the talk. Most of these like quite lime-rich situations, often with a bit of groundwater inflow. Obviously, the groundwater can't really be supplied to a garden pond. The lime-rich water maybe could be if you happen to live in a limestone area. I mean, these are certainly very interesting types of algae, and they're associated with extremely clear water. They seem to be very, very good at locking in nutrients. So they're quite a good thing to have in your garden pond, but maybe not the easiest thing to get going. And finally, this is a kind of pondweed, fine leaf pondweeds. There's a number of different species. These are not easy. These are quite easy to grow, but not easy to keep going. I think they need areas that are constantly disturbed every year. And so unless you kind of clean out your pond quite vigorously, maybe in the autumn, then I think they're likely over time to get muscled out by other species. Here are some invasives. The commonest I think you'll like to see in garden ponds are these. These are the sort of Elodea group, Canadian pondweeds, loosely. There's actually a number of species. This is called Lagrosiphon major. This is Elodea nuttalii. I think basically steer well clear of anything that looks like this for sale in a garden centre or aquarium shop. They come under a variety of different names. There's an awful lot of taxonomic confusion. And I would say, they won't necessarily be sold under these names, but anything that looks like these, don't touch it with a barge pole. Crassula helmsii, this isn't usually sold. I've not seen it for sale, certainly recently. But unfortunately, you can still come across it in the wild. And I suspect you can still come across it in garden centres as well. It's quite a common hitchhiker. So it's the sort of thing you'll get a pot full of something and you'll get a little tiny piece that's growing and you think, oh, what bother taking it out? And as you can see, in wetlands and underwater as well, because it can also grow underwater, it can completely smother everything else. It's a very invasive species. Hydrocotyla ranunculoides, the floating pennywort, is another very invasive species. Again, you don't want it anywhere near your garden pond. I would have just avoid anything that has leaves that look like this. Obviously, there is a native marsh pennywort that isn't harmful, but you don't need to grow marsh pennywort in your pond. And I would just avoid anything. And then here as well, you have Azolla, the water fern, which also can be very aggressive. Both of these species can form these sort of floating mats that completely cover the water surface and will prevent any kind of oxygen exchange to the water below. So these are basically wiping out your biodiversity, or most of your biodiversity in your pond. Now, some of these things apply to natives too. I would avoid any kind of duckweed personally, and I would encourage others to avoid duckweeds. They do spread, and in a small habitat like a pond, as probably many of you will know if you've got duckweed, one piece of duckweed rarely stays like that. They like to form pretty dense mats, and there's rarely enough things in there to eat them to actually get them under control. So my recommendation there would be just to say, don't have them in the first place. If you see any duckweed, remove it straight away. And it can be done if you have a little bit. Once it's got to this kind of stage in this picture here, very, very difficult, and you might always be better starting again. Water lilies as well. They're very pretty, but as you can see, they do the same kind of thing. They form a very dense cover over the pond, and they're very muscular. They're very difficult to control. I was involved once in a work party trying to clear some water lilies from Place Tannabourg, from a concrete pond in there. And that was very overgrown, and it was a horrendous job. They really are. They have these enormous, tough rhizomes. They're very, very difficult to manage. And certainly these are things you would want to keep in baskets, but they don't really like being kept in baskets. They like the freedom if they're going to form a nice bed. So I would say if you want to grow water lilies, maybe get a barrel or something like that and grow them in that and have a specific place to grow them. If you have them in your garden pond, they can get much too big very quickly. This also applies to a lot of marginal species. A lot of marginal species are very vigorous. I mean, when you see them in the wild, you get reed beds. This is Sparganium erectum, which will rapidly form a sort of swamp. And they have the same sort of thing. They have these big, tough, fibrous rhizomes that are pretty difficult to cut through and control. without using sharp tools, and you don't want to use sharp tools anywhere near a pond liner, really. So, you know, that these things will quite rapidly, if left to their own devices, break out of any pots that they're in and form a fairly dense swamp. And so you won't really have a pond anymore, you'll have a swampy area. So I would say steer clear of them, or if you do use them, find a way to control them, or use species that are very small, as small as possible. And here are some thoughts. I mean, there are lots of different species you can use, but you can actually have a rather beautiful marginal area around the edge of your pond that has all these lovely flowers in them. And, you know, rather than these big, tall, coarse sort of things, you can have things like Ranunculus flammula, which is quite a familiar little native species, very common, grows around the edge of generally low nutrient lakes and ponds. Pinguicula grandiflora, this isn't a native, of course, but we're in the garden here. It's a carnivorous plant and can quite happy growing in sort of mossy situations as long as it doesn't flood too often. Marsh marigolds, beautiful thing, completely non-invasive, lovely spring pollinator. If you want to encourage the orange tips in your garden, a bit of lady smock is beautiful, and that will quite happily seed itself around the edge of a pond. This, I think, is Juncus bufonius. I'm prepared to be corrected. I haven't identified it in detail. It's a dwarf rush. It grows to about maybe a foot high. You don't need to plant. This one seeded itself around the edge of my garden pond, and I'm reasonably happy with it there because it's formed something that's very in proportion and doesn't go everywhere. Provides a bit of cover for tadpoles and things in the shallow water areas and somewhere for dragonflies to emerge, but isn't going to take over the whole thing. And then, of course, marsh orchids. Dactylorizas actually can grow quite happily in the kind of mossy, shallow areas that you get in ponds. And, you know, if you can lay your hands on one or two, they can seed themselves quite effectively into that kind of environment. And you can have something really very attractive. So it's definitely worth looking around and experimenting with your marginal areas. So finally, I'm going to say a little bit here about weather and climate and ponds, because ponds can be quite significantly affected by weather and by climate, and that's particularly so in the wild and the natural pond. So here's the my main garden pond at the moment. You can see it's got fairly clear water. There's actually a little bit of blanket weed over this side, but it's not very obvious. And there's quite an extensive area here of submerged plants in the middle. It's mostly Potamogeton. This is that sort of Juncus that you saw earlier, and there's a few sort of terrestrial plants there as well to hide the liner. Now, this was it in May. And obviously, many of us, you will have seen, you're aware that there was quite a prolonged drought. And certainly for us, it didn't really rain between maybe mid-March and the first week in June. And so it was very low. Now, I can't remember, I actually chickened out this year, and I topped it up afterwards. But certainly that had been allowed to sort of drop naturally, and probably that was only about 10 centimeters or less deep. So there's quite a lot of stress going on there for aquatic life, and I have put more stress on it. So in July 2018, this was what that pond looked like, and in 2018, there was actually quite an even worse drought, or certainly as bad. And at that time, we were on a private water supply, so the private water supply was drying up. So we didn't have any option of filling up the pond. And so it got really dry. Now, there's 2 points I want you to note about this. Firstly, there's very little open water. I mean, there's a negligible amount. It didn't quite dry up, but very nearly did. And the second thing is that although the pond itself around the margins here, around the edges here, is quite dry, this area here is still actually quite damp. There's that whole area here which hasn't totally dried out, and that means that any plant rhizomes and things that are in there can still survive. And that in turn means that when we fast forward again to what it looks like now, those plants have survived quite happily, they've regrown, and everything is fine. So it does show that, provided you don't want any goldfish in there, that you can have a pond go down very dramatically and dry out, and it's okay. And you don't need to worry too much about things not being able to survive. The amphibians have all come back. We had a lot of dragonfly larvae this year. In fact, the dragonfly larvae this year, I think, mostly died when they emerged because of the wet weather. But it certainly wasn't the case that this drought 2 years ago wiped everything out. Now, of course, the other thing you can get on ponds is ice. Not so much of it these days. It's been quite a few years now since we've had any serious ice. This isn't here, obviously. This is Canada, you can. We tend not to get the sort of serious long-term cold that you get in many continental climates, and I think that's quite important, because some of the advice that's being given about pond depth and about what to do in winter tends to be more about thinking about these kind of situations where you can get ice maybe for 5-6 months of the year, and then it's a bit more of a problem. So in terms of what you're likely to encounter, even with a garden pond, water has some rather strange properties when it gets cold, because most things, most things when they as they get colder, they get denser. So the solid of whatever it is tends to be denser than the liquid, and liquids when they're cold tend to be denser than liquids when they're warm. But water, well, as you know, ice floats, right? So the ice, the solid water, is less dense than the water itself. And in fact, the dense water is at its densest at 4 degrees. So you'll actually get a sort of a layer in wintertime when it's frozen. You'll get an area of water that is about 4 degrees at the bottom of the pond, fairly constant. Then you'll get an area which is nearer the top, which is be a little bit colder, sort of 1 to 2 degrees. The air temperature could be, say, -10, and so you've got a little bit of a layer of ice forming on top there. But because ice is an insulator, that freezing downwards there is slow. It's very inefficient and slow, and it takes quite a long time. So the idea that a pond is going to freeze solid, it's just, in the climate that we have now, it's just not really right unless we get a very, very extreme weather event. It's just something that takes quite a long time to happen. There's some other things as well. Now, of course, sorry, I should have said, when you've got this layer of ice here, you can't get any oxygen exchange between the atmosphere and the pond, right? So you might think, okay, I need to be worried about oxygen getting to the animals and plants that are underwater. There's two things that can happen here. Firstly, the plants that are underwater, if it's a thin layer of ice, it's still transparent, and you can actually see plants quite often still photosynthesizing under there. So you can get a certain amount of oxygenation going on anyway, but not very much, but a little bit. But something that's maybe more important here is that actually cold water is very good at storing oxygen, much better than hot water. So if you boil a kettle, you'll see that bubbles come out, and that's bubbles, that's dissolved oxygen and other gases in the water. And in fact, the oxygen saturation at close to freezing is nearly 15 milligrams per litre, whereas, say, at 20 degrees, it's only about 9 milligrams per litre, and at 30, it's only about 7 or 8. So a that cold water in the pond probably already contains quite a lot of oxygen. And if you're a fish under that ice, there's some even better news, which is that you don't need a lot of oxygen. Again, because most of the things that live in ponds are cold water, they live in their metabolic rate when it's cold goes very low. And so compared to what the temperature, what the amount of oxygen that they would need at, say, 20 or 30 degrees, it's much lower when it's cold. So effectively, you've got a situation where you've got quite a lot of oxygen available, and you've also got very low demand for oxygen. So although you, yes, they're not getting any new fresh oxygen from the air, but the actual problem you've got, most ponds can survive for a couple of weeks under ice quite happily without there being any serious risk of any problem. There could be some circumstances when you do get an issue. For example, if you've got 250 frogs come to spawn in your pond suddenly, and then it freezes over, then that situation, there might be an issue, because obviously you've got a lot more biomass than usual, and so that would potentially lead to a problem. But in general, I don't think there's likely to be an issue. So my general advice is leave frozen ponds alone. You don't need to, I mean, there are various suggestions that you can have. Certainly don't break the ice with a hammer. That's going to shock species. It's going to potentially kill things. If you pour boiling water on, well, boiling water is deoxygenated, right? So you're pouring a load of hot, deoxygenated water into the pond. That's going to cause temperature shock for things and kill them. And the deoxygenated water could be an issue as well. There's sort of things like floating a tennis ball, which creates a very small hole. I'm not sure that a hole like that is actually going to, I mean, it might make you feel better, but it's not really going to create any appreciable oxygen exchange, I wouldn't have thought. Maybe it might, but I don't think so. On the whole, I would say leave them alone. They will be fine. So I think that's probably most of what I have to say. Just in summary, ponds have a great biodiversity. They're fabulous. Go out, have a look at them, enjoy them. They're different things you'll come across to many of the things that you'll have encountered in terrestrial environments in very fundamental ways, and they do different things as well. Ponds also benefit terrestrial species. The number of times I've been out in the garden, I heard this kind of sort of splashing noise behind me, and I realise I'm near the garden pond, and it's a sparrow having a bath. It's just lovely to go and see that kind of thing. And there's also the science that backs that up and shows that terrestrial species really take advantage of ponds. They need to be open. They need to be kept exposed to wind and sun. Give them the oxygen. Give them the sunlight. That way you'll get a healthy pond. You'll get loads of biodiversity. Keep them fairly shallow with a low nutrient substrate, but give them a substrate. Don't just rely on all that black plastic. Balance your algae with plants and with grazers. A few pond snails are a good thing. The Daphnia will generally find their way there by themselves. But if you've got a friend with an established pond, it doesn't hurt to stick a net, a fine net through it, and fish out a few Daphnia and transfer them to your own pond. You definitely can let ponds dry out if you like, and that can be a good thing. It can allow them to a few nutrients to sort of blow away out of the bottom. It can maybe help to reduce predator numbers as well, so maybe you'll get a few more frogs next year. Leave frozen ponds as they are. They're fine. They're just asleep. And if you happen to be a landowner, and you have an old abandoned pond somewhere, re-excavating it or coppicing and cutting around existing ones, I think the science really shows now that it's really beneficial. So it's a really good thing. Finally, I would encourage you, if you want to find out more about some of the things I've touched on here, please have a look at some of the various books around the place. There probably are some newer ones as well. These are some of my favourites. This is a great little book. It's from like the 40s or 50s or something like that. It's only a little dinky little book like that. It really is a sort of observer, but there's a lot of really good science in there, and it introduces you to all the major groups, so that you can, it doesn't necessarily show you all the individual species, but it'll give you that little grounding on what all the different species might be, and then you can say, okay, yeah, it's a protozoan or it's a hydra or something like that, and then hopefully that can stimulate you to looking at some other things. There are copies, not, it's out of print, I think, but there are copies knocking around on eBay or wherever. This is another very good book. This is like a sort of step up. The Collins Field Guide to Freshwater Life. It has quite a lot of individual species. Again, I really like this. Maybe it's a slightly more modern presentation, a lot more use of photographs and some sort of drawings as well. A nice book. I think we could probably do with a few really good new nice pond life books. Actually, someone ought to write some. Then there are things like the Freshwater Biological Association keys. If you're into proper biological recording of a lot of these species and identifying what these are, there's a whole series of them. I haven't shown most of them. You can get them from the Freshwater Biological Association or from online bookshops like the Natural History bookshop. Dragonflies, there's lots of great books on dragonflies. This is my personal favourite. I love this book. The drawings in it are just beautiful. It's not really a field guide, but you don't really need a field guide for the garden pond. And this has shows you some the larvae in quite a lot of detail as well, which is something that's very handy in a garden pond. And then there's this book as well about pondweeds, and there's a similar BSBI handbook to stoneworts, although the nomenclature is quite out of date now. There's quite a good Stoneworts of Poland book as well, actually, if you're interested in stoneworts. So yeah, there's loads of really good literature about ponds that I can thoroughly recommend. So thanks very much for listening. I hope this has been useful. Thanks to Carl Sayer for providing loads of useful information and graphs and the Ghost Ponds thing. Thanks to Kovnod for hosting it. And also, I mean, I've used a lot of photos from all around the place. And I'd just like to say thank you to the Creative Commons project as well, who makes so many fabulous photographs available free of charge for anyone to use. And it really helps to bring these kind of talks to life, I think. And I'd encourage you as well. I need to sort of contribute a few, and I'd encourage other people, if you've got good photos of things, to contribute to some of these projects. So thank you. And of course, I should have said, please record all your pond life sightings on Kovnod or on your other local record centre.